I pushed open the door at the end of the hall, thinking maybe it was a supply closet or an old library I could borrow a book from. The house was mostly dark, but a faint light spilled from this room, and I'd heard a low, almost satisfied laugh coming from inside. I was just trying to get a glass of water, honestly. But then I saw him. Standing by the bar, glass of whiskey in hand, looking entirely at home. Ethan. Sarah's Ethan. The very man whose arrival in my wife's life had quietly, systematically, unraveled everything I had built over 10 years. And he turned, saw me standing there, and a slow, almost amused smile spread across his face. He tilted his glass slightly, like a toast. "Well," he said, letting the word hang in the air, "I have to say, I did not see this one coming." I just stood there. My throat felt like concrete. He took a slow sip, then added, almost gently, "Don't worry. I'm sure you'll do a fine job with the hedges." I didn't say a word. Just turned and walked back into the darkness. Back to the small cottage I was living in on this sprawling estate upstate New York. I lay there in the dark, the reality of it hitting me like a physical blow. I was on his in-laws' property, working for his family, employed by the same people connected to everything I had lost. And that's how I ended up there, you know? In that house, in that situation. It wasn't exactly a straight line. Life rarely is. For years, my life was, well, just life. Nothing remarkable, nothing terrible. I was a heating technician in Boston for 9 years, working in basements and utility rooms, replacing filters. Boring work, maybe, but consistent. I had a daughter, Lily, who I loved more than anything. And I had a marriage with Sarah that felt stable, like old furniture. Solid. You just stopped noticing it after a while. Our plans were simple: pay off the condo, save a little, maybe get a small house with a yard one day. I genuinely believed we were fine. Then things started to shift. Slowly at first. Sarah would come home later, quieter at dinner. More distracted. I asked her once, "Is something going on? You've been somewhere else for weeks." She looked at me, tired. "Just work, David. It's a lot right now." And I bought it. Because I wanted to. But the distance didn't close. It widened. Eventually, on a quiet evening after Lily was asleep, she told me. She'd met someone. Ethan. The son of some incredibly wealthy businessman. Someone who lived in a world so far removed from ours, the distance wasn't just money. It was that quiet confidence you only get from never having worried about a single thing in your entire life. At first, I told myself it wouldn't go anywhere. But a few weeks later, she sat down at our kitchen table and just informed me. "I'm leaving, David. I've made my decision." Not a discussion. A notification. I remember asking, "What about Lily?" She looked down. "She'll be better off with you. I need to figure out my own life first." There wasn't an answer for that. There just wasn't. The divorce moved faster than I thought it would. Legal fees ate through our savings. The condo was in her name. When it was all settled, I had next to nothing. The one thing I kept, the only thing I cared about, was Lily. But it meant everything I did from that point forward had to account for a 7-year-old who needed stability, from a man who had very little of it himself. 6 weeks after the divorce, my manager, looking genuinely uncomfortable, told me my position was being eliminated. I sat in my car afterward, feeling nothing. For a long time. Then I drove home, helped Lily with her homework, and didn't mention it. The weeks that followed were the quietest, most frightening of my life. Rent was due. Lily's elementary school had fees. Groceries became a calculation, not a choice. I applied for every technical job I could find. Nothing. That's how I found it. A listing for a live-in gardener at a private estate. Outside the city. The salary was, well, it was ridiculously high. The explanation was right there: elderly owner with unpredictable behavior, most people leave within weeks. A small cottage on the grounds was included. I read it 3 times. Thought about Lily's school fees. I called. When I arrived at the estate, I had to just stop at the gate. Acres of gardens, hedges, old trees. A main house the size of a small hotel. Amelia, the owner's daughter, met me. Polished. Composed. The kind of person who makes you feel slightly underdressed no matter what you're wearing. She walked me through the role, no warmth at all. The work itself is straightforward, she said. Maintain the gardens. Keep the grounds clean. Show up when you're needed. What makes this position difficult is my father. He has episodes. He can become agitated without warning. Do not argue with him. Do not try to reason with him. And please, do not ask questions that aren't relevant to your work. I asked if there was anything specific I should know before meeting him. She just looked at me with this practiced expression and said, "Just don't take anything he says personally." Arthur, her father, was sitting in a huge armchair, a room lined with bookshelves. When Amelia introduced me, he just looked past me, out the window, like I wasn't even there. Then, out of nowhere, he snapped something about the hedges near the east wall and pushed a small decorative box off the side table. Amelia didn't flinch. I understood then why the salary was what it was. The next morning, after I found Ethan in the sitting room, I seriously considered leaving. But then I thought about Lily's school fees. So I decided to stay. Just 1 more week. It was practical, I told myself. The cottage was warm. Lily's fees weren't going to pay themselves. Finding another job with housing that quickly was impossible. But underneath all that practicality, there was something else. Quieter. Maybe I just wasn't ready to let one more thing be taken from me without at least standing still for a moment. So, I stayed. Ethan visited regularly. Sometimes with Amelia, sometimes alone. Always with that same easy confidence. He never missed a chance. Once, in front of 2 guests, he gestured to me, almost warmly, "This is David. He keeps the gardens looking respectable." The guest smiled politely. I kept my hands on the rake. Said nothing. There were other moments like that. Small. Precisely aimed. I absorbed each one because reacting, giving him a reason to have me removed, wasn't something I could afford. Not with Lily starting a new school year and no backup plan anywhere. I focused on the work. The gardens themselves were beautiful, truly, once you paid attention. Old rose beds, a gravel path lined with lavender. A kitchen garden that had been neglected. I spent those first weeks learning which areas Arthur cared about most, which paths he liked to walk in the mornings. That's how I started spending more time near him. He'd appear most mornings, moving slowly with a cane. I kept my distance, but I noticed things. When Amelia wasn't around, Arthur was different. Still agitated sometimes, still muttered, but there was a quiet calm underneath that surfaced. One morning, he stopped near me. "The lavender needs cutting back further than you think," he said, out of nowhere. "Don't be timid about it." I looked up. "I'll take care of it today." He nodded once and walked on. Something about his voice in that moment, steady, precise, nothing like the man who threw objects, stayed with me. Arthur was always worse after the doctor visits. Not just agitated, but genuinely disoriented. The medical team came every week or so. A rotation of specialists Amelia had arranged. And after each visit, Arthur would spend the rest of the day frantic, exhausted by his own confusion. The staff treated it as expected. I did too, at first. Then one afternoon, everything shifted. The doctors had visited that morning. By early evening, Arthur was so agitated 2 staff members had to help Amelia manage him. A nurse gave him a sedative injection. I watched through a partially open door as Arthur went from frantic to still in under a minute. Amelia stood with her arms crossed. When it was over, she said quietly to the nurse, "Make sure he takes the full dose tomorrow morning." Something in her tone. A small wrongness. Like a note played slightly off-key in a song you know well. The real crack appeared several nights later. I was coming in late from the greenhouse, cutting through the back corridor, when I heard voices from the study. The door wasn't fully closed. I slowed down because Amelia's voice had a register I hadn't heard before. So certain. It made my stomach tighten. Ethan was with her. I heard her say, "The assessment next month needs to go the right way. The dosage has to stay where it is." Then, more clearly, if they declare him competent, we lose everything we've been working toward. He needs to appear exactly as he has been. I stood still. I heard Ethan say, "And the lawyers?" Amelia replied, "Mr. Henderson has already been told to slow everything down on the estate documents. By the time anyone looks closely, it'll be done." I walked back to the cottage in the dark and sat at the kitchen table without turning the light on. Arthur wasn't simply declining. He was being helped along. The medication wasn't treating his condition. It was manufacturing one severe enough that doctors would conclude he wasn't capable of managing his own affairs. And once that was official, everything he had built would pass to Amelia, with Ethan standing comfortably beside her. I thought about leaving again that night. But I kept thinking about Arthur on the gravel path. Stopping at the lavender. Speaking in that clear, precise voice. Somewhere inside the chaos they were engineering was a man who knew, on some level, exactly what was being done to him. The next morning, I arrived in the garden earlier than usual. When Arthur came out, I waited until we were far enough from the house that no one could see us. Then I said, carefully, "Mr. Arthur, how are you feeling today?" He stopped. Looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not confusion. Something much closer to awareness. He said quietly, "Some days are clearer than others." I looked at him. "Today seems like a clear day." He held my gaze for a long time. Then, just above a whisper, "They think I don't notice. But I notice everything." I nodded slowly and went back to work. But as I walked away, I understood. We had just said something to each other that had nothing to do with the garden. And whatever happened next depended on what both of us decided to do about it. The days after that morning moved differently. Arthur and I didn't speak openly about what we both understood. We didn't need to. There was a rhythm. A look held a moment longer than necessary. A slight nod when we passed near the house. Small signals that said we were still paying attention. I kept my head down and started quietly to investigate. The medication came in small white tablets, left each morning in a marked container on the kitchen counter by the visiting nurse. I wrote the names down on a scrap of paper, kept it in my jacket pocket. Then I called Dr. Ben, a doctor I'd known for years through a mutual friend. Not a specialist. Just someone I trusted. I read him the names over the phone. Described the pattern, the timing, the dosage changes after medical visits, the dramatic difference in Arthur's behavior depending on whether he'd taken the medication. There was a pause. Then Dr. Ben said, "David, one of those is a sedative that should not be taken daily at that strength. Long-term, at that dose, it would absolutely cause the kind of confusion and instability you're describing." I asked what an alternative would look like. He gave me 2 names. "But David," he asked, "what exactly are you planning to do with this?" I told him I wasn't sure yet. That was only partially true. Through Dr. Ben, I obtained the alternative medication. He made me promise twice that I understood what I was doing. And I began making the substitution each morning, during the 15-minute window between when the nurse set out the container and when anyone came to verify it. The first few days, I was so tense, I could barely concentrate. But nothing happened. The nurse noted nothing unusual. Amelia's routine didn't change. And Arthur, slowly, then less slowly, began to come back. His morning walks got longer. He started asking questions about the rose beds, the east wall, things he had apparently cared about deeply before all of this began. One afternoon, he sat on the stone bench near the kitchen garden and said, almost conversationally, "I used to manage 30 people in one building and never raised my voice once. Funny what time does to a person." I sat nearby. "I think some things can be reversed." He looked at me steadily. "I'm counting on it." But Arthur had to keep performing. If his condition suddenly improved, Amelia would know. So, he continued playing the role. And he was extraordinary at it. Every time Amelia entered a room, the confusion returned. Objects got knocked over. Voices were raised. Ethan witnessed several of these episodes, and I watched his expression each time, satisfied, almost bored. The look of someone watching a process running on schedule. Behind closed doors, it was entirely different. Arthur worked carefully in the hours when the house was quiet, reviewing documents, reconnecting with Mr. Henderson, his lawyer, who had worked with him for years, someone whose loyalty hadn't been redirected. And something else was happening that I only learned about gradually. Arthur had been recording. Not recently. He'd begun months earlier, before I even arrived, when his suspicions first formed. Small devices placed in rooms where conversations happened. Managed during one of his clearer periods, nearly forgotten as the medication took hold. With his mind returning, he pieced together what he had collected. And what he had collected was substantial. My role in all of it was honestly smaller than this account might suggest. I substituted medication. I gave Arthur a reason to trust that someone in the house was on his side. I passed a few messages to his lawyer through channels that kept my name at a distance. But the larger architecture, the legal preparation, the evidence, the coordination? That was Arthur, operating at a level of clarity that reminded me he had built something significant over a lifetime and hadn't done it by accident. The meeting was Amelia's idea. She organized it herself, which, in hindsight, was the most useful thing she could have done. Invited the specialists, legal representatives, business advisors. Everyone needed to formalize what she intended to present as an inevitable conclusion. The morning of the meeting, Arthur passed me in the garden on his way inside. He didn't stop. Just said quietly, without looking at me, "Stay close today." I found a position near the back of the entrance hall where I could see through the open doors into the main sitting room without being visible from inside. Amelia opened with composed authority, outlining her father's condition, referencing the medical assessments, describing the impact on his ability to manage his affairs. The doctors nodded at appropriate moments. The lawyers had papers ready. Ethan sat to one side, arms crossed, the posture of someone attending a formality. Then Amelia turned to her father and said, in a tone that managed to sound both gentle and final, "I think everyone here understands that this is about making sure you're taken care of, Dad. That's all this is." Arthur had been sitting quietly. To anyone who hadn't watched him for months, he looked exactly as they expected. A little diminished. A little vague. Then he straightened in his chair. A small physical adjustment, but the room felt it. He placed both hands flat on the arms of the chair and looked at his daughter with an expression I think she had not seen on his face in a very long time. He said, "I appreciate your concern. I want to make sure everyone in this room has the full picture before any decisions are made." His lawyer opened a case. Began distributing folders. Transcripts. Audio recordings. Medical analysis from an independent specialist. A financial audit showing unusual patterns in account activity over the preceding year. The room changed. I watched it from the hallway. The shift from controlled proceeding to something much less controlled. Amelia's composure held for about 40 seconds before the edges began to show. Ethan uncrossed his arms. One of the doctors leaned forward and started reading very carefully. Amelia said, her voice still even but strained underneath, "This is not what this meeting was called for." Arthur said simply, "No, it isn't." The police came in quietly. Without drama. And the drama was somehow worse for their calmness. I watched Amelia and Ethan being walked out of that room. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something more complicated. These were people who had treated me like furniture, and who had constructed an entire plan around the slow destruction of an old man's mind. And watching them leave the room they had so carefully arranged was strange, in a way I still find difficult to describe. Afterward, when the house had emptied, Arthur found me in the garden. He walked out without his cane. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the rose beds before he spoke. He said, "Most people in your position would have taken the salary and looked the other way. I want you to know I understand that you didn't have to do what you did." I said, "I'm not sure I did very much." He looked at me. "You stayed. That was enough." We stood in the quiet of the garden for a while, and then I went back to work. In the months that followed, things shifted into something I could recognize as stable. I won't go into specifics, the specifics aren't the point. What I'll say is that one afternoon, a few months after all of it was over, I picked Lily up from elementary school on a Friday. She mentioned, the way kids mention things casually, already half resigned to the answer, that there was a book she had wanted for a long time. Something about a girl who travels through different worlds. But it was fine, she didn't really need it. We stopped at a bookstore on the way home. I bought her the whole series. 4 books. She held them against her chest the entire walk back to the car. Didn't say much. But when I buckled her in, she looked at me and said, "Dad, are things okay now?" I looked at her in the rearview mirror and said, "Yeah, things are okay now." That was the moment I felt it. Not at the meeting. Not when the police walked in. Not even when Arthur thanked me in the garden. It was in that car, in that bookstore parking lot, with 4 books about a girl who travels through different worlds sitting in my daughter's lap. That was when I understood that the chapter was actually closed. I don't work as a gardener anymore. I think about that period sometimes the way you think about something that happened to someone else. Vivid and real, but slightly removed. Like a film you watched a long time ago and still remember, without being entirely sure why it stayed with you. I only wanted a job so I could take care of my daughter. That was the whole of it. And yet, somehow, I ended up at the center of something that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what one family was willing to do to each other for the sake of what they stood to inherit. I don't have a lesson to offer. I'm not sure there is one. But I do wonder sometimes, if Lily hadn't been waiting, if the number in my account had been slightly higher that week, whether I would have heard that conversation in the corridor and just kept walking. I genuinely don't know. So, I'll ask you instead, if you had been in that house, heard what I heard, seen what I was seeing, would you have stayed?